Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCullum, and I'm here today at the British Royal Armouries, continuing our series on development of the Sten gun. Today, we're taking a look at the Mark II, which would be by far the most prevalent, the most manufactured, and really the most recognizable version of the Sten. And the Mark II is born, in fact, barely 2 weeks after the very first order is actually placed for Mark I guns. So at the time that the Mark II is developed, the Mark I hasn't even started coming off the production line. In fact, it's several months away from coming off production lines. But on March 24th of 1941, Harold Turpin was ordered to come up with a paratrooper version of the Sten gun, something that could be more disassembled than the original Mark I. Now, at the same time, also, this was before the Mark I star was introduced, before that pattern was adopted, and the government was looking for ways to even further simplify production of the Mark I Sten. So the Mark II would fill two jobs. It would be much more easily transportable, and it would be quicker and easier and cheaper to manufacture. So essentially, the one main thing that Turpin did to create a disassemblable version of the Sten was to come up with a way to mount the barrel such that it could be easily removed. At the same time, he also made the magazine well folding or rotating, which allowed the guns to pack into a much smaller space than was possible with the Mark Is. You know, having a vertical gun with a horizontal mag well sticking out of it becomes kind of a bulky thing when you start thinking about packing these in large numbers. So the rotating mag well was an important addition as well. Now, kind of like the original Mark I guns, Turpin designs this extremely quickly by modern small arms design standards. He is finished with the design by March 31st, 1941. So it took him literally a week to doodle out, essentially, his revised paratrooper disassemblable version of the Sten gun. Now, it took significantly longer for the first prototypes to be put together, and there's a 5,000 round endurance test on the new design that is run from June 29 to July 1st, 1941. And there were a number of malfunctions in the test, largely because of ammunition, but that was okay because really the only thing they were concerned with was the barrel attachment mechanism. Did it work? Did it come loose? Did it have problems with headspace? Those were the questions they were trying to answer. And the answer they came up with after that testing was, it works just fine. Now, one of the really interesting elements here is there's a really iconic picture of Winston Churchill firing a Sten gun, test firing a Sten gun, in front of a whole crowd of British officers and officials. That photograph is a Mark II Sten, and it was actually taken on June 13th, 1941. That's a picture that was taken before they'd even done the significant testing on the Mark II. I think a lot of people look at that picture and you don't necessarily realize that that is a total pre-production prototype that Churchill's trying out. Anyway, let's dive in and take a little bit of a closer look at how Turpin changed this design. As this was really the most substantial version of the Sten issued, I figured we'd add a couple of other elements here to show you. One of them being the sling. This is a very simple, actually very narrow sling here, just plain canvas. And the back end just loops through the stock hole here, and then through its own oval bracket. And our connection at the front is just this little hook that goes through one of the vent holes in, there we go, in the barrel shroud. Now, I also figured I'd bring out an example of the Sten gun bayonet, or the Mark II Sten gun bayonet. There would be, well, the Mark V Stens would be set up to just use regular Enfield rifle bayonets, but there was a purported a desire amongst some units to have a bayonet for the Sten gun, led by a lord in charge of some commandos who decided it would be a good thing. So this was developed in 42, and the way it works is just simply a tube that slides over the barrel, and then this little tab locks into one of these holes, and you can theoretically press down here to release it. I'm not even going to put that on the gun because this one is really stiff and I don't want to try and take it off. And that's not particularly unrealistic to not have the bayonet on there, because a grand total of approximately 75,000 of these were manufactured for the 2.6 million Sten guns. The bayonets were never in major service, never significantly used. You can virtually never find pictures of them actually in combat, in action. and they were all scrapped quite shortly after the war. So the Sten bayonet is a fantastic collectible for someone, but was never actually really used. Now, as part of the simplification process, in addition to making the gun more disassemblable, the stock was redesigned. So on the Sten MkI, we have a stock here that extravagantly uses 3 pieces of tube and a flat plate. Well, that can be substantially simplified to 1 piece of tube and 2 bits of flat plate. And you can see kind of how crudely welded together this is. This serves as your effective de facto grip. Do not put your thumb through the hole, by the way. That's not the intention. This is partly a place you can hang the sling and mostly a weight reduction thing. And that is your firing grip on the Sten right there. More importantly, Turpin came up with a quick removable barrel mechanism. So this spring catch has been added to the front of the magazine well. If I lift this out, I can actually rotate the magazine well down. So this would be the transport position, like so. There is a widespread theory or lore that you would do this as to act as a dust cover to close off the ejection port and the feed port. Technically that is true, but you don't want to do this because you really don't want the fit between the magazine well and the receiver tube to get loose, because that will lead you to having magazine wobble and reliability issues. However, what we're also doing here is removing this right here head from these ratchet teeth. And once that's removed, I can take the barrel shroud here and unscrew it and remove the barrel assembly. So these two are attached together, and essentially the barrel shroud doubles as a barrel nut. And that is what tightens the barrel down against this flat surface of the barrel trunnion. You can see those ratchet teeth rotating through this hole, and the purpose of this catch here, you can hear it clicking there, the purpose of that is to lock the nut in place so that it can't come loose, can't let the barrel come loose while it's being used. The development of this removable barrel and the rotating magazine box mean that you can take the whole Sten gun and pack it down into this very small, compact package. This was, in theory, useful for paratroops, although a lot of the British paratroop use was with glider-borne infantry who would presumably carry the gun into combat fully assembled. But this also made it easy to pack and transport. It is this version specifically of the Sten gun that was primarily dropped to European resistance organizations because, again, you could pack it up very compact, have a high density of weapons per weapon container. So resistance in Europe, if they're using Stens, they're almost always using Sten MkIIs. In terms of the shooting mechanics, the Mark II is essentially identical to the Mark I. All the internal parts are completely interchangeable. There are a few changes that were made, however. For one thing, the safety lock notch was moved to the top of the receiver instead of the bottom. On the Mark I, you'd pull the bolt down. On the Mark II, you lift it up. The charging handle itself was changed. Instead of just being a round piece of cylinder stock, now it's textured, it has a little flat pad here, and there would be a number of different iterations of charging handles. So you can see some detail of this one. One of the other elements in the manufacturing of the Mark II is that instead of the parts all being made in-house by each arsenal or factory that was producing the guns, the British came up with a scheme for distributing manufacture to literally hundreds of small shops to make the various incremental small parts of the Sten. And one of the results of that, aside from being able to diversify and protect the production against bombing raids from Germany, was also a wide variety of subtle variations in parts. So we also have cocking handles like this and like this, and there are some other variations as well. And that's the case on a lot of small parts. There will be subtle changes. Note here also where the Mark I had a front sight that was riveted out on the front end of the barrel shroud. Since that's removable now, the front sight is this gigantic triangle that is mounted on, well, basically on the trunnion, just in front of the mag well. The rear sight remains the same though. A more substantive change during the production, actually fairly early during the production of the Mark II Sten, was the development of this style of buttstock, which was even faster, cheaper, and easier to make than this already quite simple one. This could be manufactured from a single piece of flat steel that was rolled into a semicircle and then just bent into shape around a jig, welded into place here. Note that where this pattern of stock has a T-lug going into the bottom of the receiver there, they simplified even that on this pattern to just a hook that slots up into the back end of the trigger mechanism. So this never actually replaced the earlier stock. You will see both of these used interchangeably. In fact, you'll see them used interchangeably on both the Mark II and Mark III Stens. Again, part of the distributed production scheme was that you could take parts of different patterns like this and just use them interchangeably. One other element that you will sometimes see on Mark II Stens is a push-through charging handle where there's a hole on the opposite side of the receiver tube. I can snap that through, and that will lock the bolt in the forward position. This was a response to the classic open bolt submachine gun problem of if you have the bolt closed with a loaded magazine in the gun and you somehow hit the back of the gun, whether you are, say, dropping it or you jump out of a truck and bump it on the ground, it's possible for the bolt to come back far enough to pick up a cartridge. It only has to come back this far to pick up a cartridge, and it won't have caught on the sear in that travel. And then it would take that cartridge, slam it forward, and fire it, often as not, into someone around you because it's not an intentional firing. So in theory, you can prevent this by either not having a magazine or by carrying the gun with the bolt locked open. But of course, that means that the action is open and debris can get into it. So there's a desire to carry the gun bolt closed, sealed up, with a magazine ready for action. The solution to this potential safety issue was that push-through bolt. This is something that was an issue for virtually all open bolt submachine guns. Now, this, I don't have the exact date, this appears to have been instituted in 1943 at some point. It, I think, was part of the Sten Mark IV program. The Mark IV was a whole series of experimental guns, none of which went into mass production. But they seem to have developed this for the Mark IV. This was included in the Mark V from the very beginning. Late production Mark IIs had it, and early production Mark IIs were sometimes retrofitted with it. So it's a feature you will occasionally see. Guns are correct with or without it. After successful completion of its endurance trial, the Sten Mark II went through a little bit of more formalizing and then was accepted for production and issue to British forces. The first contracts were written out in 1941 for production of the gun. Again, we're still here, these contracts are being issued before the Sten Mark I has actually been delivered. So this is a very fast timeline. And the design blueprints, the whole technical data package for the Sten Mark II was actually sent abroad to all of the different Commonwealth countries. Or, well, I don't think it went to South Africa for some reason, but they sent the design to the Canadians, New Zealanders, Australians, and Indians. And in fact, the first factory to start producing the Mark II, or the first one to get a contract for it, was the Long Branch Arsenal up in Canada. Now, ultimately, this would be manufactured by 6 different factories, the 3 Royal Ordnance factories at Thiel, Fazakerley, and Enfield, of course, Long Branch in Canada, Wellington in New Zealand, and BSA, Birmingham Small Arms, in the UK. And a grand total of about 2.6 million of these guns were manufactured. That's why they became the visually iconic version of the Sten gun, as they were the most produced version by a pretty wide margin. Contracts were written for production of these all the way out until March of 1945. So right up to essentially the end of the war, the Sten Mark II remained in production. There would be a Mark III version, which we'll look at in the next episode, as well as a Mark V version, but neither of those was produced in enough quantity or had the other requisite qualities to take over production from the Mark II entirely. It wasn't until 1957 that the Sten Mark II was formally declared obsolete. Of course, it was ultimately replaced by the Sten Mark V as well as by the Sterling submachine guns, but those are subjects for other videos. Stick around. Our next episode in this series is going to be on the Sten Mark III. Big thanks to the British Royal Armouries for giving me access to their immense collection of small arms and Sten guns in particular to show you for this video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.